is the government's MyEFO said in December 2013 that there will be a redirection of legal policy reform and advocacy funding amounting to a cut of $43.1 million over 4 years, I think. Correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, of course. I understand the cuts are staggered over the forward estimates as follows: $4.6 million this financial year, $6.5 million in 2014-15, $16.3 million in 2015-16 and $15.7 million in 2016-17. The only further detail provided in MyEFO is that the cuts will occur by removing funding support for policy reform and advocacy activities provided to 4 legal assistance programs. So the 4 legal assistance programs, which ones are those? Thanks.
Well, could I... we'll get to the particular answer, but can I just address the broader issue you've opened up, Senator Wright?
As long as it's a response to my question, I'd appreciate that. I just don't want to spend too much time talking about things I don't need to know.
I think it's important, and I think you and I may have a philosophical difference here, but...
Well, we'll explore that perhaps, I think.
But I do want to make clear the government's position.
With respect, Senator, I'd appreciate it if you did make sure that my questions are answered, because I know I have limited time and I have some very specific questions to ask today.
They will be, but it's important to give context here.
Perhaps briefly.
We have to find savings in every portfolio. The only 2 areas of government that have been specifically quarantined from savings are the Defence Department and medical research, health and medical research.
Senator, can I interrupt you? I'm sorry, no, I do need to say this, because this happens often and I end up running out of time for the specific questions I have, and it's very frustrating because I have people who really want to know the answers to the questions. So I'm going to try and ask you, not for the justification, but the detail of what the cuts might mean, because naturally there are people who want to know what these will mean so they can actually forward plan.
Okay, well,
so that's what my question's about.
I'll tell you what the cuts
announced.
Sorry?
So the 4 legal assistance programs, what are they? Could I just clarify that, please?
If the cuts
they were announced in MyEFO, and that's what I'm asking about.
Fair enough. Fine. And if you could
I just want to make sure my information's right and where those cuts are going to fall.
If we could confine ourselves to the answers, Minister.
I would appreciate that.
The effect, Senator Wright, you asked the effect of these savings.
First of all, I asked what the 4 legal assistance programs are. That's my specific question.
Well, you also asked about the effect of the savings.
No, not yet, I haven't. I will come to that. But not yet, and I'll ask specific questions about that. So if you could just tell me what the 4 legal assistance programs are that we're talking about here, that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Senator, the 4 legal assistance programs are actually those that I just noted in the context of the NPA review.
All right. Do you think
so that is in relation to, firstly, the legal aid program, secondly, Indigenous legal assistance program, thirdly, community legal services program, and fourthly, the family violence prevention legal services program. I should just note in relation to that 4th program, Senator, that program now resides with the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to ask you something that would probably take quite a significant amount of time, I imagine, but I would like a broad overview and then I'd like the detail, and that is what every organisation whose funding will be affected by these measures. Okay, I presume that there's various organisations that receive funding under these 4 areas. If you could at least, off the top of your heads, tell me what they are. I don't know if you can answer those in full detail today or whether you need to take those on notice.
Well, I think we'll take that on notice then.
Well, perhaps generally then, what sort of organisations are going to be affected?
Well, this is what I was trying to get to before, Senator.
Okay, now we can come to it.
Okay, well, now I can. You read the note to the MyEFO, and I want to explain to you the approach the government's taken.
I would appreciate brevity.
The kind of services that where the savings will be found are in what is sometimes called policy and advocacy. You see, Senators, well, you're aware, but others may not be, that most of what the legal assistance sector or the access to justice sector does is casework, helping specific people who are too poor to afford a lawyer. But increasingly, over recent years, an increasing percentage of the legal assistance dollar has been spent on advocacy, what is called advocacy work or policy work, which is not directed to helping specific clients with specific needs, but in participating in a sort of social, as it were, society's discussion about various areas of potential law reform or identifying gaps in the legal system. Now, that's a good thing to do, but in my view, and I hold this view very strongly, where resources are limited, I would rather see that money spent helping individual people in need who can't afford a lawyer rather than spent on policy development. So that's where the savings will be found.
And so what my question then is, please advise of every organisation whose funding will be affected by this measure, and please advise at what point in relation to each of those organisations will the loss of funding be effective. That's specific information that there are many, many organisations that are keen to understand and know.
Sure, we'll take that on notice.
Now,
but can you clarify, when you say the loss of funding will be effective, are you after a date, are you?
Well, yes, essentially,
Okay.
because
All right.
we've got the forward estimates and we've got the
We can
figures
take that
over
on
the forward
notice.
estimates, but we want to understand what the implications of this is. And your response there, Minister, brings me to my next question, which is really very important. Because there is a concept that many people understand to be that prevention's better than cure, and there's certainly a strong argument to be made that by providing systemic change where there are manifest injustices, it's far more efficient than dealing on a case-by-case basis where many people won't get help at all, and those who do clog up the courts having their cases dealt with. But that's potentially, possibly a philosophical and certainly a difference that you and I have.
It is, but it's also a practical difference too.
But what I want to understand is my EFO states that funding for the provision of these so-called frontline legal services will not be affected. I'm really interested in understanding how the department will apply or distinguish in an organisation's work between so-called frontline legal services and others, because I asked this question at the last estimates session, and in relation particularly to Indigenous legal aid funding, and an answer was not able to be given to me there. I'm wondering if you have now criteria that you would apply so you can actually be clear that you're not going to be funding other than, what are frontline services? How do you distinguish what they are?
Yeah. Look, it's not a hard distinction to draw, Senator Wright. And,
well, it was last time. I'm interested that it isn't now because they couldn't answer it last time.
Well, Senator, I actually don't recall that exchange with you, but in any event...
Well, it wasn't with you, it was with the department. I think it might have been Mr Manning.
Mr Fredericks can give you
Maybe
a practical example of how that distinction is being observed.
Yeah, Senator. So a practical example of that is in the current guidelines for the CLC program. So that defines law reform and legal policy as an activity where projects are undertaken which have the potential to influence and affect changes to the law, legal processes and ultimately service delivery.
I think there's also...
So what are you saying there? That what does that mean? You've pointed me to that.
That's the guideline.
I think, Senator, that really is actually an articulation of the guidelines of effectively what the Attorney-General was saying to you.
And can I give you a very...
So that is frontline or that's not frontline? Or
That's not frontline.
No, so...
And Senator Wright, there's a very practical test I think we can apply. I'm not pretending this is universal, but I think it will apply in the overwhelming majority of cases. Whether there's a client, whether these services are actually helping a flesh and blood individual, or whether they are in the nature of essentially academic work or advocacy work that is not related directly to assisting a particular client in a particular case.
What if there are arguably 1,000 clients who are affected by what is a systemic injustice or a systemic practice that's occurring whereby advocating for legislative change might be a very efficient way of dealing with that issue, as opposed to those 1,000 clients across Australia going to community legal centres, seeing a lawyer, taking action in a magistrate's court or tying up the court time and having a personal individual rectification of that problem.
Well, I understand the point, and I've had this discussion with many people, including you, Senator, and if I may say, you are a very thoughtful and constructive contributor to this debate. But what you're describing, Senator, is law reform. And that's what we all do. It's what you do, it's what I do, it's what the department does, it's what any one of a number of NGOs do, it's what law societies and other professional bodies do. It's what the Law Council of Australia has a whole section devoted to. And my point is that this is a need being catered to by a large variety of governmental and non-governmental institutions. But I'd actually like to see 100% of the legal assistance dollar spent on people who need it in their particular circumstances.
And there is an argument, of course, that in fact those organisations who are going to be apparently restricted to dealing with one-on-one clients.
They're not being restricted, they're just not being funded to do something
well, essentially, in many ways, that will ultimately be a
There
restriction.
might be an argument, Senator, and this is a nice discussion, but this is Esther's.
No,
Can
I'm
you ask
asking,
a question,
I am
please?
about to ask the question, and that is
Yeah,
because
coming.
the Minister has engaged me in discussing this.
Well, the Minister shouldn't
so-
at
well,
estimates,
he's
and
a naughty boy,
I'll
but
be
anyway.
more vigilant in the future.
But what
I'm sorry, Mr.
my
Chairman.
point is that many would say that in fact it's these very organisations who deal with the coalface of where these systemic issues are, who are uniquely in a position to know and to advocate for the effective. And there's a proud history of that, where there has been
But Senator,
reform to egregious sort of
I understand
injustices.
that, Senator. I understand that, Senator,
Anyway.
and I said that it's a useful activity, but they can do that anyway.
Well, they can't
They don't need to be funded by the Commonwealth to engage in advocacy as lawyers and as citizens.
well-
But they do need the funding to look after particular clients who, because of their poverty, can't afford a lawyer. And I'd rather they spend the money doing that.
And that's what they say they do, of course. But